There is hardly another example in modern history of a government so systematically driving its own people to starvation. But what makes it truly spine-chilling is this. One of the sparks that ignited this catastrophe was a tiny bird, or more precisely, the decision to eradicate that bird. Today we will cover the greatest silenced human tragedy of the 20th century, the Great Chinese Famine. And the role of sparrows in this story is far greater than you might think. On October 1st, 1949, a man stepped before a crowd in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. The Chinese people, exhausted after decades of civil war, Japanese occupation, and chaos, were living what was perhaps the most jubilant moment in their history that day. Mao Zedong took the podium and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up." In that moment, millions truly believed. Everything was about to change. Equality would come, justice would come, prosperity would come. But what came was a catastrophe none of them had imagined. The moment Mao came to power, he began putting the great transformation in his mind into action. In his view, China was still a primitive agricultural society, and this situation needed to end as soon as possible. He wanted to surpass England within a few years, overtake the Soviet Union, and make China the world's most powerful industrial state. In 1958, in pursuit of this goal, he launched a massive campaign that would go down in history as the Great Leap Forward. But this leap would lead not forward, but straight to the edge of a cliff. Peasants were torn from their individual lands and incorporated into vast collective farms, known as people's communes. The fields now belonged to no one and everyone, but in practice, since Alan or in parlance, this meant no one took real responsibility. On top of that, millions of peasants were redirected from farming to steel production. Small iron smelting furnaces were set up in village squares, gardens, and even in front of homes. Farmers, teachers, the elderly, children. Everyone began working these furnaces, but the vast majority of the steel produced was nothing more than a useless, low-quality pile of iron. To meet quotas, people were melting down door knockers, pots, and farm tools. In other words, the tools that would secure future harvests were being destroyed to fill today's quotas. The fields were left ownerless. Crops that needed to be harvested had rotted. But the real destruction was coming from another front. This is exactly where the sparrows enter the scene. In 1958, Mao Zedong launched a campaign he called the Smash the Four Pests Campaign. On the target list were rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows. The reason sparrows were added to this list was extremely simple. Sparrows ate grain. According to Mao's calculations, each sparrow consumed a few grams of grain per year, and the sparrow population in China numbered in the millions. Therefore, eliminating sparrows would directly increase grain production. This idea was not based on any scientific research. It was born from pure arithmetic, or more accurately, from Mao's intuition. And there was no one within the party who would dare object. The moment the campaign began, the entire country mobilized. People of all ages took to the streets with pots, pans, drums, and flags. The mission was clear: prevent sparrows from landing. The birds were constantly startled and forced to keep flying. Exhausted sparrows dropped dead mid-flight. Nests were destroyed, eggs broken, chicks crushed. This great hunt continued across every corner of China. Within a short time, millions of sparrows had been wiped out. The Beijing administration celebrated this victory with great enthusiasm. The press ran glowing reports. The party used the success as propaganda material. But nature did not celebrate this victory. Sparrows didn't just eat grain. They also ate locusts, caterpillars, and many other agricultural pests. Some scientists had raised this fact before the campaign even began. Several ornithologists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences documented in reports that sparrows were indispensable to the ecosystem and that in their absence, insect populations would spiral out of control. These reports were handed to party officials, and they were ignored, because Mao had decided, and objecting to Mao could mean not just the end of one's career, but of one's life. When the sparrow population collapsed, swarms of locusts, with no natural barrier left, descended upon the crops. The fields, already largely neglected that year, were completely devastated by this insect invasion as well. Famine had already begun knocking at the door. People had disrupted grain production on one side, and on the other, destroyed with their own hands the most important natural balance that protected their grain. By 1960, Chinese ornithologists were able to speak out more loudly, new reports showing that it was bedbugs, not sparrows, that were the true pests were delivered to Beijing. Mao quietly stepped back. Sparrows were removed from the pest list and replaced by bedbugs, but this acknowledgement came far too late. The ecosystem had already been disrupted. The famine had already begun. And this famine was something far too deep and painful to be compared to an ordinary food crisis. By the end of 1959, food production had fallen dramatically, but the state was still exporting grain, both to pay its foreign debts and to send the message to the world that the Great Leap Forward is progressing successfully. While peasants went hungry, grain from state warehouses was being shipped abroad by the boatload. Moreover, local officials, Wookiees under quota pressure, were confiscating the last remaining scraps of grain from peasants. Those who tried to flee were caught. Migration to other regions was banned. Seeking help from the state was next to impossible, because officially, the famine didn't even exist. The fundamental cause of this situation was a horrifying contamination of information flowing through the party. Local officials constantly reported exaggerated production figures to their superiors. Bringing bad news meant the end of a career. No one could tell Mao, this policy isn't working. Every level passed inflated numbers up to the next. As a result, Beijing believed China was achieving record harvests, while in the villages, people were forced to eat grass, roots, and tree bark. Defense Minister Peng Dehuai was one of the rare individuals who tried to break this silence in 1959. He wrote a direct letter to Mao stating that the policy was wrong and that severe problems were being experienced in rural areas. This act of courage cost him his job. Branded a right-wing opportunist, Peng was removed from his post and publicly humiliated. This event sent a powerful message to everyone else in the system. Telling the truth was far more dangerous than staying silent. The famine continued until 1961. In some regions, its effects were felt until 1962. Estimates of the death toll remain contested to this day, because the Chinese government concealed this data for decades. Research conducted by independent historians reveals that the death toll was somewhere between 15 million and 55 million. The fact that these estimates span such a wide range is no coincidence. Much of the data still lies in classified or destroyed archives. Frank Decoder, after years of research in Chinese archives, exposed the details of this picture in his book Mao's Great Famine. Yang Jisheng, a journalist whose own father perished in this famine, wrote his work Tombstone after more than a decade of research. He took enormous risks in China to write this book. The Great Chinese Famine cannot simply be defined as a nutritional crisis. This tragedy is a testament to what happens when ideology overrides science, to how institutional silence can bring down an entire system. It is historical proof that even the elimination of a flock of sparrows can destroy millions of lives. No earthquake, no hurricane has ever wiped out this many people in this short a time. Because this was not a natural disaster, it was a destruction created by humanity's own ignorance, fear, and silence. Illuminating this dark chapter of history is both a responsibility and a necessity, because to forget is nothing other than to prepare the ground for history to repeat itself. Who would have thought that the elimination of a sparrow could pave the way for the deaths of millions? Which part of this story shook you the most? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to read your thoughts. The like and subscribe buttons are right below. It takes 2 seconds, but means everything for keeping this content alive.